What do you mean my account is overdrawn? That's impossible, I said, staring at my phone in mock surprise as Brandon's sister ranted about the rent money he'd promised her. He did what? When? I kept my voice steady, letting her believe I was just learning about my husband's betrayal. My name is Isla Thompson, and my husband Brandon just became one of the biggest mistakes of my life. But not in the way he thinks. That Sunday morning when I woke up to an empty bed and a cruel note on the fridge felt like a slap in the face, even though I'd been expecting it. Goodbye. Never loved you anyway. Real classy, Brandon. I'm a forensic accountant in Milwaukee, and I've spent the last 15 years tracking financial fraud for some of the biggest corporations in the Midwest. So when my own husband started showing signs of planning his great escape 3 months ago, let's just say he wasn't exactly dealing with an amateur. The first red flag was when he started asking about our retirement accounts, showing sudden interest in our finances after years of letting me handle everything. Then came the secret phone calls, the unexplained absences, and the way he'd change his computer screen whenever I walked into the room. Classic signs of someone planning to bolt. I'd seen it all before in my line of work. What Brandon never realized was that every suspicious transaction, every hidden purchase, every attempt to quietly move our money, I saw it all. Each step he took to try to rob me blind was documented, photographed, and sent straight to my lawyer. By the time he left that note, thinking he'd pulled off the perfect escape, I had already moved our savings, flagged our accounts, and prepared for every scenario he might try. So when the fraud alerts started flooding my phone that Monday morning, I couldn't help but smile. Brandon thought he was 10 steps ahead, but he had no idea he was walking straight into a trap of his own making. The phone kept buzzing with notifications, declined transactions, failed withdrawal attempts, frozen accounts. Each one was like music to my ears. My hand brushed against the folder marked "Just in Case" sitting on my desk, filled with months of evidence that would destroy not just his escape plan, but his entire future. As I listened to his sister's desperate voice on the phone, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. You might think I was devastated, finding out my husband of 8 years never really loved me. But here's the thing about being a forensic accountant. You learn to see patterns. People think they're clever when they're hiding things, but money leaves a trail. Always. And Brandon? He left breadcrumbs everywhere. I met Brandon at a charity gala 6 years ago. He was charming, successful, or so he claimed, and seemed to have his life together. He worked as an investment advisor, drove a nice car, and talked about building a future together. I was impressed by his confidence, his ambition. Looking back now, I should have noticed how he always deflected questions about his clients, how vague he was about his past. The first 3 years were good, or at least I thought they were. We bought a beautiful house in the suburbs of Milwaukee, planned exotic vacations, and talked about starting a family. But there were always these little things that didn't quite add up, like how he'd get defensive whenever I asked about his student loans, or how he'd change the subject when I mentioned meeting his old colleagues. "You don't trust me?" he'd say, turning it around on me. "Why do you need to know everything? Don't you think I can handle my own finances?" Classic manipulation. I'd seen it countless times in my work, people using emotional leverage to avoid financial transparency. But I let it slide because I wanted to believe in us, in him. That was my first mistake. Then came the signs I couldn't ignore. Last Christmas, he insisted on separate accounts for our holiday spending. "It'll be more romantic if we surprise each other," he said. But I noticed the credit card statements he thought he'd hidden, showing purchases at high-end jewelry stores, jewelry I never received. The weekend business trips that didn't match any conferences I could find. The mysterious calls from numbers that always went straight to voicemail when I was around. Most wives might have confronted their husbands immediately, but I'm not most wives. Instead, I started pulling bank statements, tracking transactions, and building a case. Every time he thought he was covering his tracks, he was actually giving me more evidence. I watched as he slowly tried to drain our accounts, thinking I was oblivious to it all. "You're working late again?" he'd ask, feigning concern while I sat at my computer. Just catching up on some cases, I'd reply, not mentioning that the case I was working on was his. The breaking point came 3 weeks ago. I was working late, actually late this time, when my colleague Susan rushed to my desk. Her face was pale, and she was clutching her phone like it might bite her. "Isla, you need to see this," she said, her voice shaking. "I was reviewing the Thompson case files when I found something. It's about Brandon." My stomach dropped as I looked at her screen. There it was, Brandon's name, linked to a series of suspicious transactions we were investigating. Not as a witness or a victim, but as a person of interest. The same patterns I'd been tracking in our personal accounts were showing up in his professional dealings. He wasn't just planning to leave me. He was running from something much bigger. "There's more," Susan whispered, scrolling through the documents. "He's been named in 3 other fraud investigations. Different states, different names, but the same MO. He finds successful women, marries them, then disappears with their money. The last one was in Phoenix, just before he moved to Milwaukee." The pieces started falling into place. The charm, the secrecy, the sudden interest in our finances, it was all part of his pattern. I wasn't his wife, I was his next target. And he had no idea that his latest mark was someone who specialized in catching people exactly like him. That night, I sat in our kitchen until dawn, going through everything with fresh eyes. The loving husband act, the careful manipulation, the way he'd slowly tried to isolate me from my friends and family. It was all so clear now. I found myself laughing, not because it was funny, but because of the sheer irony. He'd picked the wrong woman to con. I spent the next 3 weeks preparing. Every morning, I'd kiss him goodbye like nothing was wrong. Every night, I'd listen to his lies about work while documenting every suspicious transaction. I moved our savings, contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, and gathered evidence that would not only protect me, but help his previous victims. "You seem different lately," he said one night, studying my face. "Is everything okay?" I smiled, thinking about the trap I'd set, about how his own arrogance would be his downfall. "Just tired from work," I replied. "You know how it gets this time of year." He nodded sympathetically, probably thinking I was working hard to earn more money for him to steal. If he'd paid more attention, he might have noticed the gleam in my eye, the one that said I knew exactly what he was planning. But con men like Brandon never think they'll be the ones getting conned. And that's the thing about people who make a living betraying others. They never expect to be the ones getting played. The morning after Brandon disappeared, his plan started unfolding exactly as he'd expected. The first call came from our bank. Unusual activity, multiple withdrawal attempts, credit cards maxed out. The second was from his sister Kelly, hysterical about the money he'd borrowed. The third was from a woman named Rachel Clark in Phoenix, asking if I knew where her husband was. Her husband. The words hit me like a bucket of ice water. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" I gripped my phone tighter, sitting down at my kitchen table. "Brandon Murphy. He's still legally my husband," Rachel explained, her voice tight with anger. "He disappeared with my savings 3 years ago. I've been tracking him ever since." I smiled despite myself. "Actually, here he went by Brandon Thompson, and you're not going to believe this, but I've been expecting your call." Over the next hour, Rachel and I compared notes. Same charming smile, same investment advisor story, same pattern of slowly draining accounts before disappearing. But this time, there was one crucial difference. Me. "I've gathered enough evidence to bring him down," I told her, "but I need your help to catch him." That's when my phone buzzed with a text from Brandon. "I'm sorry, can we talk? Just one last time?" Perfect. He was following the pattern I discovered in Rachel's case, reaching out after the initial disappearance, trying to manipulate his way into one last chance to access any remaining funds. I showed the text to my lawyer, who was already preparing our counterattack. "Let's set the trap," she said, her eyes gleaming. I agreed to meet Brandon at a coffee shop downtown. When I arrived, he was already there, looking appropriately remorseful. His eyes were red, his clothes slightly rumpled, the perfect picture of a man who'd made a terrible mistake. "Isla, I'm so sorry," he began, reaching for my hand across the table. "I've been going through some things, dealing with some bad investments. I panicked." I pulled my hand away, playing my part perfectly. "How much trouble are you in, Brandon?" His eyes lit up. Just a flicker, but I caught it. He thought I was falling for it. "About $200,000, but I have a plan to fix everything. I just need access to our emergency fund." I pretended to consider it, watching him squirm. "The emergency fund, right. The one you tried to empty yesterday?" His face fell for just a second before he recovered. "That was a mistake. I wasn't thinking clearly. But if you help me now, I promise—" To what? To disappear again? Or to stick around long enough to drain my accounts like you did to Rachel in Phoenix? The color drained from his face. For the first time since I'd known him, Brandon Thompson, or Murphy, or whatever his real name was, looked genuinely shocked. "You know, the funny thing is," I continued, sliding a folder across the table, "if you'd done your research, you might have realized that stealing from a forensic accountant wasn't your smartest move." Just then, 2 FBI agents approached our table. I stood up, straightening my jacket. "Oh, and Brandon? You might want to call a lawyer. A good one." As Brandon was being led away by the FBI agents, my phone lit up with a call from Susan. Her timing couldn't have been better. "We've got him," she said, her voice triumphant. "The team just finished analyzing those offshore accounts you flagged. Brandon isn't just running a marriage con. He's been operating a massive Ponzi scheme. We're looking at fraud in the millions." I watched through the coffee shop window as Brandon was placed in a federal vehicle. He looked small now, nothing like the confident man who thought he'd outsmarted me. "How many victims?" I asked, already knowing the answer would be ugly. 23 so far, spanning 5 states. 12 marriages, all to successful women in finance. But here's the kicker. He was planning something bigger. We found evidence of a new investment firm he was setting up. He was going to use your credentials and reputation to lure in high-net-worth clients. I thought about all those late nights when he'd ask about my cases, showing sudden interest in my work. He wasn't being supportive. He was gathering information, planning to exploit my professional reputation for his biggest scam yet. "The irony," I said, "is that if he hadn't gotten greedy, if he'd just stuck to his usual marriage scam, he might have gotten away again, but he just had to go bigger." "That's not even the best part," Susan continued. "Remember that country club membership he insisted on last year? Turns out he was using it to meet his next target, Caroline Mitchell, the hedge fund manager. He was already laying the groundwork for his next disappearing act." I recalled all the Sunday golf games, the late-night networking events. While he was playing the devoted husband at home, he was setting up his next victim. But Caroline Mitchell wasn't just any hedge fund manager. She was one of my closest friends, and she'd been working with me to document Brandon's every move for months. "Let me guess," I said. "Caroline gave you access to all their private conversations?" "Every email, every text, every recorded conversation in the club lounge. He literally handed us a blueprint of his entire operation while trying to seduce her. The guy practically wrote our case for us." I couldn't help but laugh. Brandon had spent months meticulously planning his exit, thinking he was the smartest person in the room. Meanwhile, every person he thought he was manipulating had been working together, building an airtight case against him. "Have you heard from his sister Kelly?" I asked, thinking about her frantic call this morning. "That's another interesting thread," Susan replied. "Turns out she's not his sister at all. She's an accomplice. They've been running this scam together for years. She plays the desperate sister to explain why he needs to borrow money urgently right before he disappears. She's being picked up in Chicago as we speak." I sat back in my chair, taking it all in. The scope of Brandon's deception was breathtaking, but so was his blindness. He'd been so focused on maintaining his lies that he never noticed the trap closing around him. "One more thing," Susan added. "We found his real identity. His name isn't Brandon Thompson or Murphy, it's Brandon Roberts. and he's been wanted for fraud in Canada since 2015. I smiled, thinking about the massive case file waiting on my desk. Well, Brandon Roberts, welcome to your worst nightmare. I was about to head back to the office when my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from an unknown number. You think you're clever, but you have no idea what's coming. Check your email. The message was followed by an email containing detailed photos of me with my family, my daily routines, even shots through my home windows. A chill ran down my spine, not from fear, but from anger. Brandon had hired someone to watch me. I forwarded everything to Susan and my lawyer, then made a call to the FBI agent in charge of Brandon's case. Agent Morrison? We've got another player in the game. Already on it, she replied. The photos were sent from an IP address we've been monitoring. James Foster, Brandon's former cellmate from a brief stint in Phoenix. He's been working as Brandon's muscle, threatening victims who get too close to exposing the scheme. I thought about Rachel Clark, wondering if this was why she'd waited so long to come forward. Where is he now? That's the thing, we can't locate him, but he's probably... Agent Morrison stopped mid-sentence. Hold on. There's movement on one of Brandon's frozen accounts. Someone's trying to access it from inside your house. My house. Where I'd left my laptop open. I called Rachel immediately. Is everything okay there? We have a situation, she whispered. Kelly's here. She must have had a key. She's trying to access Brandon's accounts from your computer. Kelly, the fake sister, who was supposed to be in custody in Chicago. My mind raced through the possibilities. Either she'd escaped or... Rachel, get out of there now. Kelly's not working alone. I heard a crash in the background, followed by Rachel's sharp intake of breath. Too late, Foster's here too. My heart pounded, but my mind remained clear. This was exactly the kind of desperate move I'd anticipated. Rachel, remember what we discussed? It's time. Through the phone, I heard Rachel's calm voice. Hey, Kelly, before you do anything stupid, you might want to look at what's on that screen. I smiled, knowing exactly what they were seeing. Every file, every account, every piece of evidence wasn't just stored on my laptop. It was being live-streamed to the FBI's servers. Plus, the whole house was under surveillance with agents stationed nearby. It's over, I heard Rachel say. Look outside. The sound of sirens filled the background as FBI agents swarmed my house. Within minutes, both Kelly and Foster were in custody, and Rachel was safe. I drove home to find Agent Morrison waiting for me. Quite a performance, she said. You knew they'd try something like this? People like Brandon, Kelly, and Foster, they always get desperate at the end. They're so used to being in control that they can't handle losing it. I looked at my house, now a crime scene. I just had to make them think they had one last chance to win. Well, with this attempted break-in and the threats, we can add witness intimidation and conspiracy charges to their list. Agent Morrison smiled. I'd say your trap worked perfectly. I thought about Brandon sitting in his cell, probably still believing he could talk his way out of this. He had no idea that his desperate final move had just given us everything we needed to ensure he'd never scam anyone again. 2 months later, I sat in the courtroom watching Brandon's world crumble around him. Gone was the confident smile, replaced by a look of utter defeat as the judge read out his sentence. Brandon Roberts, for multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, conspiracy, and witness intimidation, this court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison. I caught his eye as they led him away. For a moment, his mask slipped completely, and I saw the panic beneath. The man who'd written "Never loved you anyway" on a note in my fridge now faced a future where love was the least of his concerns. Kelly and Foster didn't fare much better. Both took plea deals, but they'd still serve significant time. As part of their agreements, they provided evidence against Brandon's entire network, exposing operations in 3 countries. Rachel sat beside me, squeezing my hand as Brandon's victims, my unexpected sisters in survival, stood one by one to share their impact statements. Each woman told a similar story of betrayal, but ended with the same note of triumph. We'd not only gotten justice, we'd gotten our power back. After the sentencing, Agent Morrison approached me with a smile. The Bureau could use someone with your skills. Have you ever considered consulting for us? I thought about all the other Brandons out there, all the scammers who thought they were too clever to get caught. You know what? I think I'd like that. Yeah. As I walked out of the courthouse into the bright Milwaukee sunshine, I felt lighter than I had in years. Brandon thought he'd destroyed me, but he'd only made me stronger. And now I had a new mission, ensuring he would be the last con man to underestimate a woman with a talent for numbers and a mind for justice. 6 months after Brandon's sentencing, I stood at a podium in a packed conference room at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division in Milwaukee. Behind me was a presentation detailing what they now called the Thompson case, though that wasn't his real name or mine anymore. I'd taken back my maiden name, wanting nothing to do with any of Brandon's aliases. The modern con artist doesn't use a gun, I told the room full of agents and analysts. They use trust, manipulation, and technology. But they all leave a trail. You just have to know where to look. The program I'd developed with the FBI was already showing results. 3 major romance scam rings had been busted in the past month alone. Rachel had become one of our most valuable consultants, her experience helping us understand how these predators chose their targets. After the presentation, I checked my phone to find a message from Susan. Another victim of Brandon's had been located in Vancouver. Unlike the rest of us, she'd lost everything: her house, her savings, her business. But this time, we could help her recover what was stolen. The forensic team had finally cracked Brandon's encrypted files, revealing accounts he'd hidden all over the world. I thought about that Sunday morning when I'd found his note, how he'd tried to break me with 5 cruel words. Instead, he'd given me a gift, the chance to help others fight back against people like him. My new apartment overlooked Lake Michigan, and as I sat on my balcony that evening, I smiled at the irony. Brandon had spent his life taking things from strong women, but in the end, he'd inadvertently created something powerful. A network of survivors turned warriors, all dedicated to taking down men like him. Sometimes the best revenge isn't just surviving, it's thriving. I stared at the message on my phone, a faint smile playing at my lips despite the gravity of the situation. Flying to Rome with my lover. Have fun being poor. James's last taunt glowed mockingly on the screen. Oh, if he only knew. My name is Natalie, and at 29, I never expected to be tracking my husband's attempted escape through JFK Airport while coordinating with an international task force. But here I was, parked outside the terminal, watching the operation unfold through the feeds on my laptop. The irony was almost poetic. James thought he was being clever, draining what he believed were our personal accounts. He had no idea those accounts were actually fronts we'd set up weeks ago when we first caught wind of his embezzlement scheme. As Senior Vice President of Finance at Morton and Blake Investment Group, my husband had been systematically stealing millions from client accounts for months. He thought he was untouchable, brilliant even. That arrogance would be his downfall. I'd known something was off for weeks. The late nights at the office, the secretive phone calls, the sudden interest in our financial arrangements. When I discovered the first traces of suspicious transfers, I didn't confront him. Instead, I took my evidence straight to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. That's when Agent Catherine Torres entered our lives, though James knew her only as Amanda, the gorgeous new client who seemed so interested in both our investment services and him personally. Target is approaching security checkpoint. Agent Torres's voice crackled through my earpiece. He's with the female operative now. I watched through the camera feed as James strutted through the terminal, his arm around the waist of who he thought was his mistress. He had no idea she was one of our best undercover agents, or that every step he took was being monitored by a dozen law enforcement officers. Remember, I spoke softly into my mic, He's likely carrying the backup drive with all the transaction records. Don't let him dump it. Copy that, came the response. The pieces were all in place. Now it was just a matter of watching my husband's grandiose escape plan crumble around him. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Looking back, I should have seen the signs sooner. 6 months ago, when James started pushing me to combine all our accounts, I'd assumed it was about trust and marriage. He'd presented it so convincingly over dinner at our favorite restaurant, his brown eyes earnest as he talked about building our future together. I was touched by his apparent desire for transparency, never suspecting it was all part of his plan to gain access to everything. But James didn't know that my background in forensic accounting wasn't just a line on my resume. Before joining Morton and Blake, I'd spent 3 years tracking down corporate fraud schemes. The skills never quite leave you. The attention to detail, the ability to spot patterns in financial discrepancies, the instinct for recognizing when something just doesn't add up. The first red flag was the change in his routine. James had always been methodical, leaving for work at exactly 7:30 a.m. and returning by 6 p.m. Then suddenly, he started having emergency client meetings that kept him at the office until midnight. I might have believed it, except I caught him slipping once. His urgent client call showed a Dubai area code at 3 a.m. their time. The second warning came from his newfound interest in our home security system. He insisted on upgrading everything, adding cameras and motion sensors. At the time, I praised his attention to our safety. Now I realize he was paranoid about being watched himself, especially in his home office where he did most of his illegal transfers. Our account manager called, he'd mentioned casually last week. She suggested we diversify some investments. I'll handle everything. The confidence in his voice almost masked his nervousness. Almost. That's when I contacted Agent Torres. Within hours, we had a plan in motion. The FBI had already been investigating a series of suspicious international transfers from Morton and Blake, but they needed solid evidence linking it to someone inside. I could provide that connection. "I'm doing this for us," James had whispered this morning as he kissed me goodbye, thinking I was still asleep. "We'll have everything we ever dreamed of." If he only knew that his dreams of escape were about to turn into his worst nightmare. My phone buzzed with another message. This time it was a photo. James at a champagne bar in the terminal, toasting with the woman he thought was his mistress. "Thanks for making this so easy," he wrote. "BTW, I took a little extra from your personal emergency fund. Consider it payment for 5 years of pretending to love you." The words hit harder than I expected. Even knowing what kind of man he truly was, even after discovering his crimes, something about that casual cruelty made my chest tighten. I thought about the night we met, both new employees at Morton and Blake, sharing takeout Chinese food during late-night training sessions. I remembered how he'd brought me soup when I had the flu, how he'd held my hand at my father's funeral. Had it all been an act? "Target is getting restless," Agent Torres reported through my earpiece. "He's checked his watch 3 times in the last minute." I pulled up the security feed from the terminal. James was trying to look relaxed, but I could read the tension in his shoulders. He kept glancing at his phone, probably checking the time until his flight. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. He was carrying my father's vintage leather briefcase, the one I'd inherited after Dad passed away. The realization sparked something in me. This wasn't just about the money anymore. This was about every lie, every manipulation, every moment he'd used my trust against me. I thought about the clients whose lives he'd potentially ruined, the families whose savings he'd stolen, all while playing the role of devoted husband. "Agent Torres," I spoke into my mic, my voice steady despite the emotion building in my throat. "The evidence is in my father's briefcase. He always said it was the safest place to keep important documents. Knowing James, he's using it to transport the backup drive and any incriminating papers." "Copy that," she responded. "We'll make sure to secure it." I watched as James checked his phone again, his expression growing more anxious. He had no idea that his mistress had already alerted airport security about a suspicious package. ensuring they'd be pulled aside for additional screening. He didn't know that we'd frozen the accounts he thought he'd drained. He was probably wondering why his Rome-bound flight was mysteriously delayed. Time to end this charade. I picked up my phone and typed out one final message. Maybe you should talk to the police officer behind you first. Through the security camera feed, I watched James's face transform as he read my message. His confident smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of panic as he spun around. The police officer wasn't actually behind him, not yet, but his reaction told me everything I needed to know. He was guilty, and he knew he was in trouble. All units in position, Agent Torres's voice crackled in my earpiece. We've got eyes on all exits. James was moving now, walking briskly toward the international terminal, my father's briefcase clutched tightly against his chest. His mistress kept pace beside him, one hand casually resting on his arm. I knew she was making sure he couldn't bolt. My phone rang, a number I didn't recognize. I answered, keeping my eyes fixed on the security feed. Your little game stops now. James's voice was cold, controlled. I've got copies of every transaction you've ever signed off on. If I go down, you're coming with me. I felt a chill run down my spine. He was bluffing. He had to be. I'd been careful, documenting everything since I first suspected his scheme. But there was something in his voice that made me uneasy. Really? I kept my voice steady. And what transactions would those be? Don't play innocent, Natalie. Those offshore accounts? The shell companies? I've got proof you were involved from the beginning. Who do you think they'll believe? The devoted husband trying to protect his wife's interests, or the scorned woman seeking revenge? My heart raced. He was trying to twist this around, make me look like the guilty one. Classic James, always manipulating the situation to his advantage. But he'd made one crucial mistake. Interesting theory, I replied. Have you shared this evidence with Amanda? There was a pause. Through the camera feed, I saw him glance at the woman beside him. What does she have to do with this? Everything. I allowed myself a small smile. You see, Agent Torres has been very interested in hearing about those offshore accounts. The color drained from his face. On the screen, I watched him take a step back from his companion, realization dawning in his eyes. But it was too late. In one fluid motion, she had his arm behind his back. James Anderson, you're under arrest for embezzlement and corporate fraud, she announced, her voice carrying across the terminal as other agents moved in. But then something happened that I hadn't expected. James started laughing. Oh, Natalie, he said into the phone, his voice full of mockery despite his position. You really think this is over? Check your email. I just sent you something interesting from the corporate server. Turns out your father wasn't as clean as you thought he was. The phone slipped in my suddenly sweaty palm. With trembling fingers, I opened my email. There it was, a folder labeled Thomas Bennett Project Files. My father's name. I clicked it open and my world shifted beneath my feet. The documents filled my screen. Transaction records, emails, meeting minutes, all dating back to when my father was CFO at Morton and Blake 15 years ago. My hands shook as I scrolled through them. Project files showed systematic manipulation of accounts, carefully hidden beneath layers of legitimate transactions. The pattern was familiar, because it was the exact same method James had been using. Natalie? Agent Torres's voice cut through my haze. We've got him secured, but he's demanding to speak with his lawyer before... He knew, I interrupted, my voice barely a whisper. All this time, James knew about my father's involvement. That's why he chose me. That's why he pushed so hard to work at Morton and Blake. Through the terminal's security feed, I could see James being led away by agents, that smug smile still playing on his lips. He'd known this moment was coming. Even in handcuffs, he had an ace up his sleeve. Your father's case was before my time, Agent Torres said cautiously. What exactly are we looking at? I quickly forwarded her the files. James didn't create this embezzlement scheme. He found my father's old blueprint and expanded on it. The offshore accounts, the shell companies. Dad built the foundation 15 years ago. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Every memory of my father, his integrity, his principles, the lessons he'd taught me about right and wrong, now seemed tainted. Had James been watching me all these years, waiting for the perfect moment to use this information? My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "I've got more files, much more. Drop the charges or everything about Thomas Bennett goes public. Your choice, darling." I felt sick. James had orchestrated this perfectly. If the truth about my father came out, it wouldn't just destroy his legacy, it would implicate dozens of current Morton and Blake executives who had worked alongside him. The scandal would devastate the firm and everyone connected to it. "He's trying to leverage this, isn't he?" Agent Torres asked, reading my silence. "Yes," I admitted, "but he's made one critical mistake." I pulled up the original files my father had left me, the ones stored in an encrypted drive I'd found after his death. James didn't know about these, couldn't know about them. Dad had documented everything, including the names of those who had forced him into the scheme. "My father wasn't the mastermind," I said, my voice growing stronger. "He was the whistleblower, and I can prove it." The pieces were falling into place now. Dad hadn't been able to come forward before his death, but he'd left everything I needed to finish what he'd started. James had only seen half the story, the part that looked incriminating. He had no idea he'd just handed me the key to exposing the entire corruption ring at Morton and Blake. I rushed to my office at Morton and Blake, Agent Torres following close behind. The building was nearly empty at this hour, but I knew exactly where to look. My father's old office, now a storage room, held the final piece of evidence we needed. "Your father suspected this might happen," I explained as we descended to the basement level. "He left me a series of clues in his personal journals. I never understood them until now." The storage room was cluttered with old filing cabinets and forgotten furniture. In the corner stood my father's ancient desk, deemed too heavy to move. I ran my fingers along its underside, finding the hidden catch he'd described in his journals. With a click, a small compartment opened. "Got it," I breathed, pulling out a weathered USB drive. "Ms. Bennett," a voice called from the doorway. We turned to find Harold Wright, Morton and Blake's current CEO, watching us with cold eyes. "I believe you have something that belongs to the company." 2 security guards flanked him. This wasn't good. "Actually," I replied, keeping my voice steady, "this belongs to the FBI now." I handed the drive to Agent Torres, who quickly secured it. Wright's facade cracked slightly. "You're making a serious mistake, Natalie. Think about your career, your reputation, your father's legacy." "My father's legacy?" I felt a surge of anger. "You mean the legacy you and the board created when you forced him to participate in your scheme? When you threatened to destroy him if he didn't help hide your fraud?" Wright's expression darkened. "You can't prove any of that." "Really?" I pulled out my phone and played a recording, my father's voice, weak but clear, documenting every detail of the board's corruption in his final days. Dad may not have lived to testify, but he made sure the truth would come out. Wright lunged for Agent Torres, but the security guards, who I now realized were actually FBI agents, grabbed him first. As they led him away in handcuffs, I noticed James being escorted through the lobby below. Their eyes met, and I watched the color drain from my husband's face as he realized his powerful allies couldn't help him anymore. "Your father would be proud," Agent Torres said softly. I nodded, emotion threatening to overwhelm me. The evidence on that drive would expose decades of corruption at Morton and Blake, clearing my father's name and bringing down everyone involved in the scheme. James had thought he was so clever, using my father's past against me, but he'd never understood what kind of man Thomas Bennett really was. My phone buzzed. Another message from James. "We can still work this out. I'll tell them everything about your father's involvement." I smiled as I typed my response. "Go ahead." The whole truth is exactly what I want them to hear. The next morning, I sat in the FBI's Manhattan office, watching the dominoes fall. On multiple screens, news channels broadcast the same story. Massive fraud scheme exposed at Morton & Blake, CEO and executives arrested. Agent Torres handed me a coffee as we watched the coverage. 17 arrests so far, she reported. Your father's evidence was bulletproof. The encrypted timestamps proved the board's manipulation of his original reports. They can't claim he was acting alone. James appeared on one screen, being led into court. His designer suit was wrinkled, his confident smirk replaced by a look of defeat. The reporter's voice cut through the room. James Anderson, along with CEO Harold Wright, faces multiple charges of fraud and embezzlement. Sources say the scheme dates back 15 years, with recent evidence revealing attempted whistleblowing by former CFO Thomas Bennett. Your father's name has been cleared, Agent Torres said softly. I nodded, emotion tightening my throat. Dad had sacrificed everything to expose the truth, carefully documenting the corruption while appearing to play along. He'd known the evidence would eventually surface. He just hadn't lived to see it happen. An email arrived from James's lawyer. My client wishes to convey the following message. You've ruined everything. I hope you're satisfied. I smiled as I drafted my response. Please inform your client that he ruined everything himself. And yes, I am satisfied. Justice has finally been served. 1 month later, I sat in the courtroom as the judge delivered the sentences. James's face remained emotionless as he heard the verdict. 20 years for corporate fraud, embezzlement, and attempted flight to avoid prosecution. Harold Wright and the other executives received similar sentences. The corruption at Morton & Blake had been completely exposed, and the firm was undergoing a total restructuring under new leadership. The federal investigation had recovered most of the stolen funds. The money would be returned to the affected clients, along with compensation from the firm's insurance. My father's detailed records had made this possible, his final gift to the people he'd tried to protect. After the sentencing, Agent Torres approached me with an unexpected offer. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division could use someone with your skills, she said. Someone who understands how these schemes work from the inside. Would you be interested in consulting for us? I thought about my father, about how he'd fought to expose the truth while protecting his family. I thought about all the other companies where similar frauds might be happening, other families who might be suffering. Yes, I replied, I would. As I left the courthouse, I felt lighter than I had in months. My father's name had been cleared, justice had been served, and I had found a new purpose. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about getting even. It's about making sure the truth finally comes to light.